Eric, to kick things off, you want to give us a quick intro on yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Parag. Excited to be here today. I'm Eric Youngstrom. I'm the founder and CEO of Onramp Funds. We provide working capital solutions purpose-built for the e-commerce small business segment. So really focused on Shopify and Amazon sellers, companies that are literally kind of their first couple of months into a few years old. Typically, our customers are tens of thousands of dollars in revenue to up to kind of 30 million in revenue, and strong going concerns, but we even work with guys who are just their first 30 days in. So very excited to help to help this market grow, to work with the small business owners and just give them more tools that make them more likely to succeed and become sustainable.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'm Parag Mamnani. I'm the founder and CEO of Webgility. This is a webinar mostly focused on Onramp, so I'll be happy to share more about Webgility over the course of the presentation. But been in the e-commerce space for now over 2 decades and been partners with Eric over the past couple of ventures. And so we've known each other now for over 10 years. And I know we haven't had the opportunity to do one of these in a while. So I'm glad to finally get to do this webinar with you and excited to partner with Onramp on this opportunity. Diving right in, we're going to be talking today mostly about working capital. So what is working capital? What are the different sources of capital? And tie that into Eric, his company, Onramp, and the services and the capabilities they provide for e-commerce merchants to accelerate their business growth with working capital. Eric's also going to be talking about a few customer case studies so that we can really bring to light what this working capital means for small businesses out there and how many companies have been able to really supercharge their growth with their support. We'll talk a little bit about how it works and how you can get started. And we'll also then talk a little bit more in depth about how do you actually assess how much capital do you need. But before we jump in, it'd be really helpful to hear from the audience kind of what is your level of awareness. So it set the stage a little bit for what kind of information we should tailor in this presentation. And we know we have a lot of attendees, both here live and many that are going to be looking at this in a recorded session. But at least to set the stage, we'll jump into a poll. And the first question we have is, have you used outside working capital for your business? And the second will be following up with what types of business credit. But let's get started and jump right in to the first question, which is, have you used outside working capital for your business? And Alexa, if you would, help me go ahead and launch the poll. We can see what the audience has to say. Okay, have you used outside working capital for your business? And looks like results are coming in here. For the rest of you, if you could, just a couple more people here left to fill in the poll. And we've got a bit of a mixed bag. We've got, I'm going to end the poll here. So we've got a couple of folks that said, 1/3 of the audience shared that they have used outside capital, and a third said no, and a third were unsure. So Eric, we've got a mixed audience here. And we're going to need to, I guess, really tailor the presentation to cover all of our bases. So
Perfect.
we'll dive right in, and maybe, that's the best place to get started. First and foremost, what is working capital, Eric?
Well, according to the bullet here, right, it's a measure of your short-term liquidity and financial health. More importantly, it's the cash you need to drive sales. And so one way you can think of it is almost just, what is your cost of goods sold, and do you have that capital available to drive that? If you understand the cash flow statement, which gets to be pretty detailed, and it's probably the hardest financial statement to understand, it's really just understanding what's that timing from when you have to deploy capital, most simply for purchasing inventory, to when each discrete unit of inventory is sold and you've received the sales deposits for it, and that the amount and the time that it takes to cycle that is your working capital line that you need so that you've got sufficient funds to drive sales. On top of that, you can layer in your cost of advertising, cost of shipping and fulfillment, because Those are also expenses you're going to incur prior to getting a sales deposit from the order that comes through. And so really it's making sure you have sufficient cash to drive that. And in looking at those survey questions, right, some customers have used, or some of the attendees have used working capital in the past from outside sources. Others weren't sure, and others said no. I would argue that almost everyone has used working capital from an outside source, because most small business owners are actually using a credit card. Now, they're guaranteeing that personally. So eventually it is their money that's kind of backing this. But during the term of the payment cycle, and if you're not paying that card in full, but maybe paying it over time, you're really leveraging the credit card company's cash for that working capital need. And what you'll find then in the industry are companies like Onramp, purpose-built with a working capital solution uniquely aligned to e-commerce, and then other short-term financing companies who really aren't built for e-commerce. They're built for retail. They're built for small business, right? But that's not really aligned with the e-commerce cash flow cycle. But it's tools that are available, right? And so for the customers that said no or unsure, more likely than not, what they've been using are credit cards, right? They haven't moved into that next stage of the business, which is where you're really looking for a specific provider unique to the working capital needs of the business, as opposed to just a generic tool that's kind of shoehorned in there.
And Eric, would you say there's something that's happened in the e-commerce industry lately that's really caused this sort of rise in a lot of providers and the demand for working capital? What's really created this real big need in the marketplace for working capital solutions?
Sure. So the demand, as e-commerce has come into existence over the last 25 years, the demand is there for any business. Every business has a working capital cycle. Each business has a unique cycle. And then, within an industry, there will be averages that an industry follows that are, let's put it this way. Oil field services here in Texas have a much longer working capital cycle because it takes a long time to build a pipeline than e-commerce, right? Because e-commerce is a faster turnover industry. And then within e-commerce, right, different businesses will have different cycles depending what they're manufacturing, what they're selling, and what their sales process looks like. The reason you see so many more providers in this space is that as e-commerce becomes a bigger and bigger portion of retail, there are a lot of Wall Street guys, a lot of credit providers who are looking for opportunities to deploy funds who have moved into e-commerce. What we see that we find interesting is that most of the companies and most of the providers in the space are very much traditional SMB lenders, but they have products for dry cleaners and for restaurant owners. They're not purpose-built for e-commerce, which then means that the business owner, the e-commerce business owner, actually has to pay more attention to it, has to do more work to make it work for their business, because it's not actually designed around the e-commerce industry. And that's where companies like Onramp and a few others that have entered the market are really unique, in that we've built a product from the ground up specific to the needs of e-commerce, to the point that at Onramp, we don't work with we don't work with dry cleaners or restaurant owners. We only work with e-commerce merchants who sell physical goods, who have to go purchase inventory, have to store that inventory, sell the units one at a time, ship them one at a time to the customer, and then repeat that cycle over and over again to run a business, which makes our product, we think, far easier for the business owner to use and far more cost effective for that business owner.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think you jumped to kind of the next piece, which is inventory seems to be the crux of this challenge, is purchasing inventory. Is that typically the heaviest lift in terms of amount of capital that needs to be allocated? Is it mostly on inventory, or do you see businesses allocating capital to more, say, short-term, marketing and advertising, or to kind of create demand, or, manage vendors and other technology investments? Where do you see this sort of working capital invested most effectively?
We see it most, from a weighting perspective, most heavily used for inventory, because that's typically the biggest cost in your cash conversion cycle and your cost of goods sold, is that cost of inventory. And it's a cost that cycles over and over and over again, right? So if you've don't have inventory in stock, there is no reason to go pay for advertising, because if somebody clicks the ad that you've now paid for, but can't complete a shopping cart transaction, then that was wasted ad spend, to get that customer there. Clearly, you're not going to have a fulfillment expense if there's no order, and if there's no inventory, there can't be an order, and if there's no order, there's no shipping cost to move
right.
just an order. So inventory really kind of starts your cash conversion cycle from a working capital perspective. With that inventory available, though, then there is a need to go deploy funds to drive the demand, right? Google pay-per-click, Amazon advertising, other advertising channels. And then as you're receiving those orders, the world has come to expect, right, that order is going to arrive in my home in a couple of days, which then means, it's really, it's a super important kind of hygiene process, that orders that are coming in are processed same day or, early morning the next day, so that they're getting to the carrier, and the carrier can then get them to that customer's home, the next day or two, which means that expense is actually being incurred before the deposit comes from the sale itself, which means you have to have that funding there for your cash conversion cycle, so that you can get those receipts in and not have a canceled order and a refunded order. And so inventory, advertising, and fulfillment, they all come together. Now, on a customer by customer basis, some customers have an incredibly low cost of inventory, and they may actually see the mix of spend skewing more heavily towards advertising and fulfillment. Traditionally, though, we would say probably half the spend is really the cost of inventory, and then kind of 20 to 30, a quarter or a little bit more advertising, and then, less than a quarter would be shipping and fulfillment expenses.
And now, to your point, these things are very much tied together, right? Like, you must have a plan in place so that if you are going to take some excess capital and bring in more inventory, you better have a sales and marketing campaign lined up or advertising spend lined up so you can cycle through that inventory. You need to have also the fulfillment capabilities so that, again, you can fulfill those items. Otherwise, you end up with working capital, building a lot of stock in your warehouse, but actually haven't cycled through it, and you're just incurring an unnecessary expense.
That's absolutely right. And inventory goes stale, right? So, really easy to think about this in terms of, if you sell food, right, it goes bad over time. So you don't want to purchase too much if you can't sell it fast enough before it expires. Other inventory that may never go stale, right, or for instance perish, may still become out of fashion, right? My Fast Times at Ridgemont High t-shirt probably isn't going to sell a lot these days, not the 80s anymore, right? So having stale inventory is a problem, because then you've got to, you're going to have to go dispose of it or sell it, at a fire sale cost, right? Lose money on it, but at least clear your warehouse space out. And so this is where it's really important to understand, kind of what is that sales turnover cycle? What's the timing on that? How much inventory do you need to have on hand, so you can drive that? And then when you can see what your inventory levels are, there's an inflection point where it's time to get more. And you have to understand the timing of, your manufacturers, how long they need to produce it, then how long is it going to take to ship it from them to you? How long does it take to break it down in your warehouse or at the FBA warehouse, so that it's, the units are available to then be shipped on a per order basis. And so that timing, right, it repeats every, depending on the merchant, every kind of 45 days to 135 days, for, call it 90% of e-commerce sellers are running within that kind of timeline cycle. And it just repeats over and over and over again. If you're doing it right, what will then happen is each cycle you should be selling more than the prior cycle, because you're able to then invest in that growth, and you're driving more demand. Hopefully you're getting more historic customers to come back and purchase, while you're also getting new customers, right? Which then means you've got overall an increase in sales. And that's where then having a working capital line that's really aligned to that sales turnover cycle is so critical, because if you borrow for a year, with a 1-year payback period, you actually have to understand 4 quarters worth of e-commerce turnover, and what the need is going to be for each of those 4 quarters in advance, versus if you're borrowing on the basis of your turnover cycle, by the time your next cycle gets here, your lender can see that you've actually increased sales by 20%, and it can increase the capacity, the credit line available to you by that 20%, so that you're always keeping pace with the proven demand of the business.
Yeah, and it sounds like, you know, to your point, not only does the business need to have a good plan of how they're going to run through that cycle, but they also need to have a lot of insights into what's happened historically, right? How do they assess what their past few quarters of performance was, what kind of sales results they saw, how quickly was their inventory turning over and the cash flow, in order to really start to set the stage for the future of what their working capital needs are. But I think one of the key points to bring up here too is that past is not necessarily an indication of the future. And there seems to be, you know, there's an element of a bet and an investment and a growth mindset that business owners need to have. So it's not just about the working capital you think you might need, but it's how much more aggressively you want to invest into the growth of your business in the next few quarters so that you can start to up that working capital. When you think about these bets and the specifically kind of the audience that you work with, do you find that these are mostly business owners, entrepreneurs, or is this sort of the role of a CFO, a controller? Who's the typical person that should be really thinking about this and planning ahead and thinking about these working capital needs?
Yeah, so it's for most of the small business customers we work with, they're actually not at a point yet where they have a CFO or a full-time bookkeeper controller, in which case it's the business owner who needs to really be thinking through all of these machinations and dialing things in. Clearly, as you get bigger, right, you're going to have those people who are specializing in that. You know, so and then the other piece of it, right, is you want to be really careful when you think about that investment, making that bet. The beauty of working with a working capital provider is that working capital provider is very focused on that sales turnover and the inventory turnover. And inventory is an asset. It has a value which you can borrow against to then use that to access cash that might not otherwise be available. But what becomes really powerful about that is the cash that you have in there today, your own personal savings, your credit card, you've now freed those lines up to be reused, which means you could then decide, hey, I think I can double my sales. My working capital provider may not give me 2x what my historical sales volume would say, but I'm willing to take my own personal cash and buy an additional batch of inventory because I think I can go push those sales and the power faster. And so that's the power of having, you know, a partner on the working capital side who's going to look at your sales velocity, your sales history, who's going to then power what they think your sales turnover is. But then you can layer in your own capital on top of that to then try to grow faster.
So you've then figured out you want to grow. You've made the decision that you likely need additional capital. This is a good segue into talking about, you know, what were kind of the traditional sources, and then maybe talk a little bit about Onramp. So could you talk about what
Sure.
may be some of the traditional sources, what are the advantages, disadvantages, and then we can jump right into Onramp as a follow-up.
You bet. Yeah. So look, I mean, I think there are kind of 4 key areas. Obviously, your personal savings, right? And when you're first launching a business, it is your money that's going to be driving this business. You're making the bet. You're using what you've got in the bank, and you're getting those early sales and really getting the, you know, you're beginning to get your flywheel turning over and over again. As you do that, then the very next thing you're going to use your credit card. And honestly, you're probably using your credit card at the same time because you're using your personal card. As your business gets established, you're going to be able to get a business card, and that business card will have a bigger and bigger line. And eventually, it won't actually be personally guaranteed by you as an individual. You'll be able to have the business standing on its own 2 feet. Credit cards also easy to use, right? The challenge with the credit card is it's a 30-day payment cycle. And so it's not actually aligned with the sales turnover and inventory turnover cycles and the cash conversion cycle of the e-commerce business, which means then it requires active management on the part of the business owner, which is just time away from the rest of the business. After that, you know, really hard to get until you're probably 10 million in revenue is a bank loan, especially in the last year where banks have really restricted lending. because of all the financial turmoil that's going on in the world, which really then means it's a hard tool to get, and it even if you have all your documentation in order, audited financial statements, 3 years of tax returns, a business plan and a business case that's really easy for the bank to review and understand. Typically about 80% of banks will end up saying no to that business owner before he finds one that says yes. And for each of those banks, it's a couple hundred pieces of paper and about 90 days of time to go through that.
Wow.
So it's a very low cost solution. It does require active management on the part of the owner, but it's also, but it takes a lot to get to. And then finally, you have your traditional merchant cash advances, right? This is kind of off the shelf Wall Street tools. They're typically, kind of a 9 to 15 month term, right? Where you've got a lot of time to pay it back. The challenge with that becomes, with that time to pay it back, you still have a challenge of you're borrowing 3 to 6 quarters worth of working capital, but you don't know what Q3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to look like. And if you misallocate those funds and have spent them on equipment, right, but that doesn't generate enough sales to then pay down that line, you don't have the ability to get more later on, and you're going to have a problem that lender is looking for you to pay them back, and you don't have the funds to do so. So it's really important when you're thinking about what you're using the funds for to map the structure that they've built to what your needs are. And so if somebody wants to offer you a 9-month term, you should really be careful to say, look, I only need a quarter right now. I'm going to draw a quarter. I'm going to pay it in the quarter. And then when I get to the end of the quarter, or it's time to buy that next batch, I will go take more. If you take it all up front, you're going to pay more. The more you borrow, the more the cost, and you're going to be holding that longer, right? And money has a time value to it. So the longer you hold it, the more the cost, in which case then you're driving your cost up. And it's just not an efficient use of funds anymore.
So it's really not as simple as how much working capital do I need and what are my choices. It can get complicated pretty quickly in terms of how am I going to be using the capital, how much of it do I need now versus later, what the amount is that I'm going to be paying over time, obviously what the cost is. And it sounds like, using all of these traditional sources, you really need to kind of think through which source might even work for you and your particular needs. I imagine, given some of this complexity, is what led you to think about Onramp. So tell us a little bit more about the Onramp journey and what got you excited to build a solution to help these merchants, given the different sources that were already available.
Yeah, so look, prior to Onramp, I helped launch Shipping Easy back in 2012. We partnered together in those days as well. We were later acquired, but one of the things we saw in there was, by law, postage is currency, which means there's no such thing as a postpaid postage account for your shipping account. You have to pre-fund the postage balance, and so we would see merchants using Shipping Easy that had connected their credit card to fund their postage balance. They were getting ready to order that next postage label. It's going to cost $20 and they only had $10 in their balance. We would try to top that balance up to give them the label, but their credit card was maxed out. And so the problem there was, we could see a merchant had a known good order. It had come from Amazon, it had come from Shopify, which means the credit card had been swiped, had been approved. That in 2 to 5 days, the deposit for that sale was going to arrive at that merchant's bank account. But yet they were maxed out today, so they couldn't ship the product. And then what did they have to do? They actually had to go cancel that order, refund the order.
Wow.
Right? This creates really bad problems. One, the credit card gateway then is thinking you're a high-risk merchant, so they're increasing the reserve rates they're going to hold in that merchant. You've got a terrible customer experience, so the customer is very unhappy because they wouldn't have clicked the buy button if they just known that it was out of stock or it couldn't be shipped. And then, worse, if it's a marketplace sale like Amazon, you've now angered Amazon, because that's, the one thing they just never want, right? Is it better be in stock, it better be shipped same day.
Right.
And so we'd see this problem a lot. And as I was looking at this market kind of late 20-teens, there really weren't any purpose-built solutions. You had On Deck, you had, some crowdfunding things, right? But those were kind of 1 year to 3 year loans, right? Where you had to be really sophisticated to know how to draw that, when to deploy it, when to kind of refill it, and whatnot to grow the business. And so what I really thought was an opportunity there was with the order flow data that we saw at Shipping Easy to help you ship and fulfill orders. We actually had a really strong understanding of the sales performance of the business, the inventory turnover performance of the business, because we were helping manage the inventory. And it looked like there was a way to go build a purpose-built solution for an e-commerce business based on all of your sales data coming out of Shopify, BigCommerce, Amazon, eBay, Walmart, your payment data from your payment gateways, the banking data. And then we could use that to actually build on a per merchant basis with the merchant's unique data, a custom solution that would know the kind of cash conversion cycle timing, right? Is it 30 days? Is it 150 days? And then offer terms that were mapped to their needs so they could minimize cost, take as much cash as they needed a day. And then, if you need more cash in 4 weeks, well, guess what? It's available because your sales are proving that. And then as your sales grow, of course, your line grows with that as well, because we're here to power that working capital cycle based on the real needs of the business up to the minute.
Yeah, and it sounds like without this sort of a solution, it's not just a matter of growth. Seems like it's a matter of survival, right? Because in today's market, as the sales cycle changes and consumer expectations are changing, you could have a rush of orders and you might not actually have the capacity to fulfill them. And that could lead to poor reviews. It could lead to your store being shut down by the marketplace. So getting your working capital right seems like a really critical piece of every business. It's just core to running sound operations. And jumping into kind of the how, once someone decides that they're interested in getting working capital and really sort of starting to work with you, could you talk a little bit about the process? It says here, obviously, that, you connect and you get your cash. Tell us a little bit of kind of behind the scenes. What does that look like? How long does it typically take for someone to get connected? And by the way, before you answer that question, I do want to say to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A panel or the chat window. Just reach out, type in a question, and we'll have a few minutes at the end of this discussion to go through a Q&A as well. But yeah, use that Q&A or chat panel to ask your question. So Eric, talk to us a little bit about the process. How can merchants get started, and what does that look like?
Sure. So it's dead simple to sign up with Onramp. If you've ever signed up with a shipping application to manage your order flow, if you signed up for Webgility, you've done a very similar process, right? You're going to create a username and password, and then you're going to connect your online stores. That could be Amazon, Shopify, BigCommerce. It's typically a single sign-on. So type in your username and password of that Amazon account. Amazon will push a pop-up asking you to approve that we're going to be looking at your data, and then you're connected. Yeah, you're in our application. Within a few minutes, we have your historic order data, and we're able to tell you what kind of credit line you have available to you. After that, right, you can let us know if you'd like cash. And if you do, then we're going to ask you to connect your bank account so we can go look at that. And then we'll actually make you a formal offer in terms of how much we can give and for what term. And then our sales team will work with you to really make sure you understand all the terms and how it works. And once you're ready to say yes to that, we'll deploy funds. Typically, we'll release the funds the same day, and they'll arrive in your bank account either same day or next day, depending on the time of day when that happens. It's literally minutes to sign up, and our fastest customer is about 90 minutes from sign up to fully approved. Funds are on the way to your business. So it's just dead simple, and it means that you as a merchant, you don't have to go do things like provide us with financial statements or bank statements. You don't have to go give us your tax returns and things like that. We're not asking for a personal guarantee, right? We're doing this based on the success and performance of your business, because our goal, our mission, is to make sure that as many small businesses as possible are standing on their own 2 feet, and that it's not the business owner who's having to then go and personally guarantee these things, right? We want those business owners to be able to look at their business and say, my business runs on its own. I'm here to run it, but it's not just a personal extension of me. It's its own going concern.
Yeah, and sounds like this is too easy and too good to be true. Can you talk a little bit about, what the success rate is of sort of the people that maybe have applied? How often do people get approved? And just speak a little bit to what percentage of people do you typically approve?
Yeah, we approve more than half the people who apply.
Mm.
I wish we could say more, but I will say that the vast majority that we don't approve typically just haven't even started selling yet. Right? They sign up, and it turns out that it's day one. They don't even have a history of sales yet, so there's nothing to go underwrite against. The other thing that we do see is we don't support all online sources yet. So if you sign up and you're selling on a cart that we don't support, I can't pull that data in and then make that offer. So there are kind of a lot of reasons why we may say no. And then the other one that we typically see is just customers might already have essentially short-term lines in place, 6 months to 3 years, but they've kind of used up that working capital capacity. In that scenario, we actually work with the customer to help them understand when we can provide cash. And what we'll do then is work with them, and it might take 60 days or 120 days till they get to a point where they've either paid that line off or paid it down enough that we can then start providing capital that's really aligned to their business cycle. And then what we try to do then is become that working capital partner and help them then reallocate those other funds for things that are more appropriate for, say, a 3-year term, maybe equipment financing for a conveyor belt for your warehouse, right? But you certainly don't want to use your working capital for that, right? Most sellers are going to finance that stuff and offer you terms. So use their financing because it's structured for their product.
Yeah, and that actually brings up, I want to pull up a quick question that came into the Q&A panel here. Is a question from Mark. He talked about these funds once they're available. Are there any restrictions on how the seller can use them?
There aren't restrictions. Well, the restrictions are it has to be used for business purposes. These are not consumer loans. And so this is to power your business. Beyond that, there aren't restrictions, but it's really important to understand the structure and the repayment expectation. If you were to borrow from Onramp and go spend that money on a Toyota pickup truck, you've got a problem because the inventory has to sell, right? To generate the sales to be necessary to pay it back. And so you don't want to use our funds for something like that. Toyota has financing, use their money for that pickup truck purchase, right? It'll be structured specifically to the purpose. And so what you really want to think about when you're borrowing is, the structure of this is tied to sales. And so if it's tied to sales, you want to use it to drive sales. Now that can be for advertising, shipping and fulfillment expenses, could be for video production, which we have some customers doing. It could be for inventory, right? All of those things are appropriate uses. And so what you want to make sure is that you're deploying those funds in a way that are going to drive those sales. And so if inventory is getting low, good time to go buy more inventory so that you have enough that, that next order can be fulfilled. If you've got sufficient inventory, it's time to go drive that advertising to get those orders in the door. And then, hey, I've got the orders. Let's make sure that we have the funds necessary to generate that next shipping label and get that order to the customer so that the deposit's going to stay good. And so, right, like it's super important to understand the structure of the financing so that you're using it for the appropriate things. The beauty of that becomes equipment financing people don't mind seeing a working capital line because their collateral is the equipment, and they actually have a different expectation in terms of repayment, just like the Toyota pickup financing guys have. And so in those cases, right, you can actually have a working capital line, an equipment line, a vehicle line, all next to each other because the business supports it, and the payment terms for each are very, very different around why people would make the loan to you. And so then it just becomes a part of really understanding what the lender has an expectation around the use of those funds and using those appropriately so you keep your lender happy. And that lender then wants to loan you more and increase the line as the success of the business is performing.
Yeah, so a lot of it really has to do with your run rate. And I think you have a really great case study here about the plug, and they seem to have, really accelerated their growth, and they've borrowed about $1.5 million or so over 9 months. You want to talk a little bit about this customer of yours?
Sure. They sell a plant-based recovery drink focused on liver health and wellness, right? Just trying to help the world live healthier. We started working about 9 months ago. I think they're on like advanced number 6 with us now. They're growing rapidly. And what we were able to do is kind of jump in and help them with working capital at a time when they'd really had their own personal funds tied into it. And they were growing so fast, they couldn't extract that money to then facilitate and keep up with the growth. By leveraging Onramp, they were able to then start to see sales grow. As we saw the sales grow with our funds, that also then means their available credit line was growing with us. So that then as they paid that down, they could then get 2 more each time. And we've essentially seen a 33% increase in their borrowing capacity over the last 9 months because of the sales growth. And what that means is in the first 6 months working with us, they actually became profitable, which is really exciting, right? Because once you're a profitable business, you're at the point where you are a sustainable business. And our mission, right, is to help as many merchants as possible become sustainable based on, each individual merchant's definition of what they think sustainable is for them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And it sounds like, you've been able to do that not just for the plug, but even for some other companies. And I see another example here of Helix, another health and wellness company.
Yeah, they sell a sauna blanket. Keep warm out there. It's getting really, really warm, right? We've been working with them for about a year. They're on a little more than a year, actually. They've done 8 advances, predominantly again for inventory, but also about 20% of that has been put into, video production and things like that, and marketing to then drive sales. The really cool thing about Helix is that they've actually tripled revenue, and they've 10x the amount they're borrowing. And I think actually they're a great example of a business who I think really has been smart about how they grow. When they first borrowed from Onramp, they didn't actually borrow their maximum capacity. They took a very small line, about 5,000. And what they did was tested it. They really wanted to make sure they understood how working capital from Onramp worked. They used that for a cycle, paid it down, and then took a bit bigger bite, right? And each time they've been borrowing more and more. Now, part of that was they were growing into what they had available, but then simultaneously, because they've been using more each time, they're able to grow their business more. And so their credit line is also expanding. And so what's really exciting to see about that, right, is that, it's a smart business owner who is going to try to go grow the business, is going to experiment. But just like with, when you start selling on Facebook, you don't just have an unlimited budget, right? You're doing these kind of $500 advertising tests to get your conversion ratios, right? To see your click-through rates and things like that. And then as you prove those, right, you're A/B testing that, finding the one that works better, then expanding how much you're willing to spend on advertising because it's proven, and you're always measuring that. The same thing applies to how you think about working capital, right? Don't just go max it out, really test out how you're going to use it, how it fits in with your business, so that you can then decide that, hey, that max line, while it's nice to know it's there, it's actually more than I need. And there's no reason for me to pay for that when what I really need is 40% of it. I'm going to use that 40% hyper efficiently, keep my costs down. But I also know that, hey, if I need more, because all of a sudden I see that sales are, not just going to go by 20% month over month, but by 80, boom, I'm going to go buy that more inventory right now, make sure I'm ready to go capture that demand.
So I actually have a question along those lines, Eric, is, do you actually advise on how much to borrow?
Well, we actually cap how much we'll loan at about 40% of the revenue for the term. And that's because we want these business owners to become sustainable, and providing more capital than you can repay actually puts you in a really bad position, because then you're going to actually have to choose between, operating expenses and rent versus Onramp. And that's not a healthy place to be. And so what we think is really appropriate from a working capital perspective is about 40% max. And on average, we loan about 20 to 25%. But that's in every time there's a loan made, right, the merchant's part of that decision criteria. We're not telling them. We're kind of saying, hey, this is how much you have available. The merchants are deciding, well, how much do I need to draw right now? And if I haven't drawn it all, well, then I can draw more later on when I need it, if it's, in a few weeks.
And how does Onramp compare, Eric, to some of these other facilities? And also, maybe you could talk. I had a question come up here. We're a few minutes into the closing here, but another question that had come up with regards to Shopify Capital, like how does this compare to some of the other capital solutions out there? So, in general, could you maybe summarize how does Onramp different?
Yeah, sure. So, we've got this nice chart here with the checks, and OnRamp does it all. One, I think we're incredibly fast, right? It's a couple minutes to sign up, and then we're doing the work. We're not asking you to come in and prove your sales success. We can see that data coming out of Shopify and Amazon. We've structured our pricing to be a percentage of sales, and that percent will depend on how much of your sales you're borrowing. And then we do that also based on the time outstanding. And so if you only need a 30-day term, your fee is going to be about a third of what a 90-day term would be because you're borrowing it for less. And so what we're trying to do then is help you optimize for what you really need. The way we structure repayment is we're actually taking, we're asking you to pay a percentage of sales for every sale you get, and you don't make those payments until those sales deposits arrive in your bank. And we know, like from an Amazon perspective, Amazon wants to deposit every 2 weeks. So there's no reason for us to start charging you today for a sale that you won't get the receipts for another 2 weeks. We'll just wait for that 2 weeks to get here. And so then it's fully automated. So you don't have to think about writing a check. You want to come in and review that statement just to make sure that you understand how the charges have been billed. And then if there's a question, right, we're here to answer those questions. And then finally, right, that means we're aligned. So if your sales slow down, you're paying less. If they accelerate, you're paying more. But the reason for that, right, is if your sales are accelerating, you're actually selling more inventory faster, which means you want to pay down faster so that you're increasing your available credit so that when it's time to go buy the next batch of inventory, which by definition will be a bigger batch than last time because sales are accelerating, that credit is available there to go get that batch of inventory. And really then with the way that we're charging right on a per sale basis, what this really means then is from an inventory perspective, rather than have to go tie up your capital 30, 60 days before you can start selling that inventory, you're actually not paying for the inventory until this deposit arrives. And so you're paying for the inventory as you sell it, as opposed to prepaying for it when you're using a working capital provider like OnRamp.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Sorry, go ahead.
The question you had on Shopify, I think the big difference there is Shopify is typically a 9 to 12 month term. And the challenge then is how much are you going to accelerate your sales each quarter or each month? And if Shopify is only going to give you a loan based on your historic performance, it's really hard to know that you're going to get enough. And if you take a year's worth, but you spend it all in the first quarter, well, if you're not paying it down, you don't actually have more available credit from Shopify to go get the next batch of inventory. And so while it's a useful tool, right, more tools are better than fewer tools. We just don't think it's quite the right tool because it doesn't align as well with what's actually happening in the business, which then means you as the business owner actually have to spend more time managing that financing versus a solution like OnRamp where the management is built into the app. Like our goal is that you should be able to postpone hiring that controller or head of finance because you don't need them to manage your working capital line because the OnRamp software does it on your behalf.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I know we're almost at time. In fact, we're over time here, but I want to take a couple of minutes and just really talk about, I think, at the heart of one of the big questions that I imagine most of our audience members have is how do you actually figure out the working capital needs you have, right? So that you can make those decisions. And obviously OnRamp provides that phenomenal tool where you just connect and it can tell you, up to 25 or 40% of your revenues, what that limit is. But I think where a lot of the decision making happens is having insights into your data. And this is frankly where Webgility comes in. And I know a few folks have had this question is, what's the role Webgility plays in all of this and why this partnership? I think it's really important to understand that you have to have access to all of your sales performance. You have to have a strong grasp of your cash flow, your sales turnover performance. You have to know all of your COGS. You need to understand the historical trends. Ultimately, it's about having a good grasp of how your business is running, what the financial health is, so that you can decide what kind of capital needs you have and start working with Onramp. And Webgility provides that solution. So for those in the audience that have not had a chance to try Webgility out, go ahead and sign up online and you can get a firsthand look at what is your performance across all of your sales channels, synchronize and manage all of that data into your QuickBooks or your financial system of record, so you have insights into what's really happening, and work with OnRamp so that you can really accelerate that business growth by finding that, perfect line and working capital that will help you power the next phase of your growth. Eric, I want to thank you so much this morning for your time, and thanks to everyone in the audience for attending. This is going to be a recorded session, so for those of you that are going to be listening offline, we will be sending out a video recording of the whole session to all of our registered attendees, and it'll also be available on both of our websites. And if you'd like to get started, link is in the chat window, onrampfunds.com/Webgility. Eric, thanks for the time, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for the time and patience going through all of these slides with me, Eric.
Thank you, Parag. No, and I couldn't agree more in terms of the Webgility solution and providing the insights around how much to borrow and the timing of that. And that's where I think the partnership between Webgility and OnRamp is great, because your customers have insights that they're going to need, and then we have the tools that map to that. So it's a great opportunity for the combined Webgility OnRamp user.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric, for the time, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a fantastic day.